the secret Swedish billionaires who control what you eat. Open your refrigerator right now and pull out a carton of milk. Look at the packaging closely and notice the faint lines where paper meets plastic meets aluminum. That carton didn't come from your local dairy. It came from a Swedish family you've never heard of. A family that controls what nearly 3 billion people drink every single day. A family that turned paper and glue into a $12 billion monopoly. And a family whose fortune is built on a simple economic truth that no one talks about. Control the container and you control the contents. Control the contents and you control the consumer. This is not a story about innovation or entrepreneurship. This is a story about capturing a market so completely that escape becomes impossible. This is the story of the Rousing family and the global packaging empire that made them invisible kings. Most people think Tetra Pak is just a packaging company. They think it's about cartons and recycling bins and little straws poked through foil. But that's the illusion. Tetra Pak doesn't sell packaging. It sells dependency. It sells a system so embedded in global food distribution that pulling it out would collapse supply chains across 6 continents. The Rousing family understood something fundamental about modern capitalism long before anyone else did. If you control infrastructure, you don't need to control the product. The dairy companies can fight over milk prices all they want. The Rousings own the box the milk comes in. And that box costs money every single time it's filled. Multiply that by 500 million cartons per day, and you begin to see the scale of the empire. This is not innovation. This is economic capture. The family's fortune started with observation, not invention. In the early 20th century, a young Swedish man named Reuben Rousing traveled to the United States to study. He visited self-service grocery stores and watched customers scoop flour and sugar into their own bags. He saw waste, spillage, contamination, and inefficiency everywhere. Then he asked a question that would change global commerce forever. Why not pre-package everything before it reaches the customer? It sounds simple now, but in the 1920s this was a radical idea. Food was sold loose, measured by hand, wrapped in butcher paper. Reuben saw a business model hiding inside that chaos. He saw a way to standardize, control, and monetize every single transaction. He returned to Sweden and founded a packaging company with a partner named Erik Kurlund. Their first factory opened in Lund in 1929, the same year the Wall Street crash wiped out savings across the Western world. While factories shuttered and banks collapsed, Reuben's packaging business quietly grew. The Great Depression made efficiency profitable. Companies needed to cut waste, reduce spoilage, and move products faster. Reuben's machines did all three. His factory produced cartons that were cheaper, lighter, and faster to fill than glass bottles or metal cans. Businesses that were bleeding cash suddenly had a way to stop the hemorrhage. The packaging itself became the competitive advantage. Reuben wasn't selling paper. He was selling survival. By the time World War II ended, his company had become the largest packaging manufacturer in Scandinavia. But the real empire wouldn't emerge until his son took over. Hans Rousing inherited the business in the 1950s and transformed it from a regional player into a global monopoly. He developed the Tetra Brick, a rectangular carton that could store liquids without refrigeration for months. This wasn't just clever engineering. This was economic warfare disguised as food safety. The Tetra brick solved a problem that plagued every government on Earth. How do you move milk, juice, and liquid food across vast distances without it spoiling? For centuries, the answer was you don't. Fresh milk stayed local. Long-distance trade required expensive refrigeration or preservation methods that destroyed taste and nutrition. Hans Rausing's carton changed that. The Tetra brick used aseptic packaging, a process that sterilized both the liquid and the container simultaneously. Food could now travel thousands of miles and sit on shelves for months without refrigeration. Governments saw this as a food security breakthrough. Hans saw it as a license to print money. Once a country adopted Tetra Pak's system, switching became nearly impossible. The machines were expensive, the supply chains were locked in, and the contracts were structured to create long-term dependency. This wasn't innovation. This was infrastructure colonization. The first major proof of this strategy came from the most unexpected place on Earth, the Soviet Union. In the late 1950s, Soviet agricultural planners faced a crisis. The USSR produced vast quantities of milk, grain, and juice, but its infrastructure couldn't move the products efficiently. Food rotted in transit. Dairy spoiled before reaching cities. The Communist Party needed a solution that didn't require building thousands of new refrigerated warehouses. They needed Tetra Pak. Soviet specialists began studying the Swedish company's technology, and by the early 1960s, a partnership was formed. Dozens of Soviet dairy plants began using Tetra Pak cartons. The results were immediate. Spoilage dropped, distribution accelerated, and Soviet citizens could finally buy milk that didn't sour within hours. For the Rausing family, this was the ultimate validation. If their system worked inside a centrally planned communist economy, it could work anywhere. But the real breakthrough came in the 1970s and 80s. Tetra Pak entered into joint ventures with Soviet state enterprises, converting military factories into civilian packaging plants. One of these ventures, Tetra Pak Loot, became one of the few successful examples of capitalist-communist cooperation during the Cold War. Think about the geopolitical implications of that. A Swedish family company operating inside the Soviet Union at the height of nuclear tensions. The Rausings weren't diplomats, but their business gave them influence that most ambassadors could only dream of. They weren't selling ideology. They were selling dependency. The Soviet leadership allowed this because the economic need was too great to ignore, and the Rausing family profited from both sides of the Iron Curtain. This wasn't just good business. This was economic neutrality weaponized for profit. As Tetra Pak expanded globally, the Rausing family began to retreat from public view. They structured their empire inside a web of foundations, holding companies, and offshore entities designed to shield wealth and avoid scrutiny. The company was placed under a Liechtenstein foundation and a Dutch holding structure. This meant no public financial disclosures, no shareholder meetings, no transparency. The Rausings controlled everything, but outsiders saw nothing. In 1982, Hans Rausing made another strategic move. He relocated his family to England to escape Sweden's punishing tax rates. Sweden's progressive tax system could claim up to 80% of income. Hans wasn't interested in funding the Swedish welfare state. He moved to Britain, claimed non-domiciled tax status, and likely reduced his tax burden to nearly nothing. The message was clear. Loyalty ends where taxation begins. Meanwhile, Hans's brother Gad stayed focused on expansion. He oversaw Tetra Pak's entry into Africa, Asia, and Latin America. By the 1990s, the company operated in over 160 countries. It controlled roughly 85% of the global liquid carton market. That's not market leadership. That's market dominance. That's monopoly. In 1991, Gadd led the acquisition of Alfa Laval, a Swedish industrial equipment manufacturer. The purchase transformed Tetra Pak into the Tetra Laval Group, a conglomerate with tentacles in food processing, packaging, and distribution. The Reusing family now controlled not just the carton, but the machines that filled the carton and the systems that processed the food inside. Vertical integration at a scale most corporations never achieve. But this kind of control comes with a price, and that price would soon become visible to the world. In 1995, the Rousing dynasty split in two. Gadd Rousing bought out his brother Hans's entire stake in the company for $7 billion. At the time, it was the largest private buyout in European history. Hans walked away with cash. Gadd kept the company. The brothers never worked together again. Hans's branch of the family moved deeper into philanthropy and high society. Gadd's branch ran the business with discipline and secrecy. The split created two parallel legacies. One branch controlled the money. The other controlled the machine. But only one branch would face the consequences of extreme wealth without purpose. Hans Rousing's son, Hans Christian Rousing, grew up in England surrounded by luxury, servants, and zero accountability. He inherited hundreds of millions but no responsibility. He had access to everything but meaning. The result was predictable: addiction, isolation, and tragedy. In 2012, Hans Christian's wife, Eva Rousing, died of cocaine abuse inside their London home. Her body lay undiscovered for weeks. When police finally entered the residence, they found Hans Christian living alongside his wife's decomposing corpse. The scandal made global headlines. The press dissected every detail. How could a billionaire family allow this to happen? How did no one notice? How did wealth become a tomb instead of a shield? Hans Christian was charged with preventing the lawful burial of a body. He received a suspended sentence. The Rousing family issued brief statements and retreated further from public view. But the damage was done. The illusion of control had shattered. The world saw what happens when generational wealth replaces purpose with privilege. Money can insulate you from consequences, but it cannot insulate you from reality. The tragedy exposed the rot beneath the fortune. In the wake of the scandal, the Rousing family doubled down on philanthropy. They increased donations, launched new charitable trusts, and positioned themselves as benefactors of humanity. Hans Rousing Sr. committed to annual donations worth $124 million, starting in 2025. The family's total charitable giving surpassed $600 million. One of the largest vehicles for this giving is the Sigrid Rousing Trust, run by Hans's daughter Sigrid. The trust funds human rights organizations, feminist causes, and refugee support programs. But critics argue that the trust promotes a specific ideological agenda. Sigrid has spoken publicly about Soviet influence on liberation movements in Algeria, Ireland, and Palestine. Her positions have drawn accusations of political bias disguised as charity. Her older sister, Lisbeth, runs the Arcadia Fund with her husband Peter Baldwin. The fund supports environmental conservation, literature archives, and academic research. The philanthropy is real. The money is substantial, but the question remains, is this generosity or reputation management? While the family poured money into charity, their business faced growing criticism over its environmental impact. Tetra Pak marketed its cartons as eco-friendly alternatives to plastic bottles. The company encouraged recycling and promoted sustainability campaigns. But the reality behind the marketing was far more complicated. Tetra Pak cartons are made from layers of paper, plastic, and aluminum fused together. Separating these materials requires specialized equipment that most recycling facilities do not have. In many countries, Tetra Pak cartons are not recyclable at all. They end up in landfills or incinerators. Studies estimate that over 90% of packaging waste labeled as recyclable never actually gets recycled. The green messaging doesn't match the outcome. The cartons protect food and reduce spoilage, which is valuable. But the same protection creates mountains of waste that persist for decades. To address these concerns, the family appointed Jane Rousing, Gad's son, to lead Tetra Laval's environmental strategy. Jane invested in renewable materials, plant-based plastics, and energy-efficient production. The company launched initiatives to increase carton recyclability and reduce carbon emissions. These efforts improved Tetra Pak's public image and reduced some environmental harm. But critics argue that the changes are incremental, not transformative. The business model still depends on single-use packaging produced at massive scale. As long as the core product remains disposable, the environmental cost remains high. Jane Rousing inherited $12.6 billion and the responsibility of defending a system built on waste. The tension between profit and sustainability remains unresolved. The family can fund conservation projects and promote green initiatives, but they cannot escape the fact that their fortune was built on billions of discarded cartons. Beyond environmental concerns, Tetra Pak has faced repeated accusations of monopolistic practices. The company's dominance in the liquid carton market has drawn scrutiny from regulators across multiple continents. In 2016, China fined Tetra Pak after a 4-year investigation into anti-competitive behavior. Chinese regulators found that the company used its market power to force suppliers into exclusive contracts and block competitors from entering the market. The fine was a clear signal. The same tactics that built the empire in Europe were illegal in one of the world's largest economies. European regulators have also investigated Tetra Pak multiple times for abusing its dominant position. The company has been accused of bundling products, locking customers into long-term contracts, and pricing competitors out of the market. These practices are not accidents. They are strategies, and they work. The Rousing family's fortune is now managed by Jane Rousing and his cousin Finn Rousing. Together, they oversee a portfolio worth over $12 billion. The portfolio includes direct investments in over 100 companies across Europe and North America. These investments span industries far beyond food packaging. The family holds stakes in pharmaceuticals, technology, real estate, and financial services. This diversification protects the dynasty from any single market collapse. Even if the packaging industry slows, the investments keep generating returns. The Rousings are no longer dependent on Tetra Pak. The company made them rich. The portfolio keeps them rich. This is how generational wealth survives. It metastasizes. It spreads across asset classes, industries, and geographies. It becomes too large to fail. The story of the Rousing family is not a story of genius or innovation. It is a story of economic capture executed with ruthless discipline. Reuben Rousing saw an opportunity in the chaos of the Great Depression. Hans Rousing turned that opportunity into global infrastructure. Gad Rousing scaled it into a monopoly, and the next generation diversified it into perpetual wealth. Along the way, the family avoided taxes, controlled information, and structured their empire to remain invisible. They operated inside the Soviet Union during the Cold War. They relocated to avoid taxation. They faced tragedy, scandal, and regulatory investigations, but the fortune never shrank. The business never stopped growing. That is the lesson of this dynasty. Control the system, and the system protects you. Today, Tetra Pak produces over 500 million cartons per day. The company operates in 160 countries and employs over 36,000 people. It generates 12.8 billion euros in annual revenue. The Rousing family no longer manages daily operations, but they remain the ultimate beneficiaries. Every carton filled, every machine sold, every contract signed feeds the same dynasty that started in a small Swedish factory nearly a century ago. The family's wealth is now estimated at over $12 billion. That wealth funds philanthropic trusts, political causes, conservation projects, and private lifestyles that most people cannot imagine. But it also funds the continuation of a system built on dependency, waste, and market control. The cartons are everywhere. The family is nowhere. That is by design. So the next time you pour milk from a Tetra Pak carton, think about the empire behind it. Think about the Soviet factories, the tax havens, the monopoly investigations, the environmental waste, and the billions of dollars flowing to a family you've never heard of. Think about how a simple box became a tool of economic control. Think about how dependency was sold as innovation. And think about the fact that 500 million cartons are produced every single day, and almost no one knows who profits from them. The Rousing family understood something most people never grasp. Wealth is not built by making the best product. Wealth is built by making the only product. And once you control the container, you control everything inside it. The ledger tells the truth. Tetra Pak's revenue is 12.8 billion euros per year. The Rousing family's net worth is $12.6 billion. Those numbers did not come from innovation. They came from monopoly. They came from capturing infrastructure and holding it hostage. They came from operating in the shadows while the world drank juice and milk and never asked who owned the box. That is the genius of the Rousing empire. They didn't conquer markets. They became the market. And once you become the market, you never have to compete again. This is the hidden history of the Rousing family. A dynasty built on paper, plastic, and the simple truth that control is more valuable than creativity. They didn't invent packaging. They monopolized it and didn't innovate distribution. They captured it, and they didn't build a company. They built a system that entire nations now depend on. That system is still running. The cartons are still being filled. The money is still flowing, and the family is still invisible. That is not an accident. That is the business model. If you want to understand how modern capitalism really works, forget the inspirational startup stories. Follow the money. Follow the cartons. Follow the Rousings, and you will see how true power operates. Subscribe to this channel so you stay ahead of the people who never learn the history. Because history is not written by inventors. History is written by accountants. And the accountants always win.